Dulles family, it's Christmas. We're so happy you're with us. We got some notes this week from different places in the country. Hi to all of you. And thank you for taking time to be part of our church family, our collected family from many different places. Okay, two quick things. Christmas is on a Sunday this year. We will not be gathering online or in person that Sunday morning on Christmas Day because the night before we will, of course, gather for Christmas Eve. So a heads up on that weekend's Christmas gathering will be Christmas Eve. And then also as a reminder, we're getting many contributions and gifts as part of our end of year investment. We're investing in some tools and equipment that we need, and really to just kind of set the start of 2023 with financial strength. If you would like to be part of this end of year investment, you can on our mobile app or our website make an offering contribution. Just add in the comment or memo line end of year campaign or end of year investment, and we'll know what that means. Okay, so it's our Christmas series start today, and I'm going to just jump in by telling you a story that happened in the mid 80s when I was learning how to ski. About an hour and a half away from my home was Bryce Mountain, a ski resort. We kind of made jokes about adding the word resort because at the time, at least in the mid to late 80s, when I was in high school, it was the smallest ski resort in North America. But it was a ski resort, and I learned how to ski there. I probably went 15 times or more as a junior and senior in high school. And I was there one night on a ski lift next to a friend named Curtis who told me a story about something that had happened there. And I never really found out for sure if this was true. He told it as if it was true. There was a lot of detail to the story. He kind of told it also like it was legend. I did a quick search this week to just see if I could find any news on this, and I couldn't. So this story is possibly true. Curtis was telling me on the ski lift one night at Bryce that years earlier in the late 70s, early 80s, the mountain was packed with skiers. The ski lift was full of people going up the mountain. And in an instant, the mountain lost power. Everything went into total darkness in 1 second. And later in the story, he told me that what they found out was that someone had crashed into a telephone power pole somewhere, and the whole area was out of power for, I don't remember what he said, maybe 3 hours. And so this ski mountain, with people skiing down it, people on the lift going up, instantly went into darkness in like a split second. And so what he described was just the sounds of people skiing into the woods or literally into trees, and describing the injuries that happened that night and ambulances lining up, an hour or two later in response to this. Some people, the way he described it, tried or thought they could ski down the mountain in the dark. And he said it was just dark. There was no moon. It must have been cloudy. I don't know. No light anywhere. And people would just ski off the trail into the woods. And there were stories of broken arms, he said, and broken wrists. And to add to the drama of this legend, people on the ski lifts were stuck for 15 minutes, turned into 30 minutes in the dark, and some thought they were closer to the ground than they were. They couldn't remember how high off the ground they were before everything went totally dark. Some people actually jumped off the ski lift thinking they were closer to the ground, and so there were stories of people, twisting ankles or breaking legs, that kind of thing. It just sounds like a bad movie. And every time I skied at Bryce after that, every single time in the years that followed, I would think of this story. What would I do? What would you do if you were thrown immediately, like instantly, into just sheer darkness? The first indication to all of us, I guess, that the Christmas season is here are Christmas lights. And my family looks forward to that. We talk about just how important starting to see Christmas lights in the community is. And, I guess we joke that the Macy's Day Parade, the first indication or announcement of Christmas is Santa at the end of Macy's. But in communities and neighborhoods, in November, we start to see Christmas lights emerging. And that's really the first sign of the Christmas season. And it's interesting with all that goes with Christmas, the songs and carols and the decorations and the traditions and the work parties, and even for faith communities, for churches, the church services and Christmas Eve and all the traditions, the very first indication that the season has arrived is Christmas lights. And Christmas lights have become important to us. We have Christmas lights all over our house during this season, and we already do now early here in December. And beyond the sort of whimsical twinkling lights or the colorful lights, the lights have really become important to us as a family because we're lighting our house, our neighborhoods are lit, our communities are lit during the darkest part of the year. And it's interesting that when Christmas traditions and celebrations really emerged in the Mediterranean region and in Europe, parts of Europe, many hundreds of years ago, it was the same in the Northern Hemisphere. It was during the darkest time of the year. And yet, the most significant part of Christmas lights is the symbol that they represent. We have many symbols at Christmas time that actually point to the Christmas story. Gifts, of course, when we stop and think about it, gift giving to loved ones and even coworkers, just being thoughtful of someone else, is symbolic of God's gift to us. God so loved the world, he gave his only son. And there are many traditions and many symbols in this season that point to the actual Christmas story. And yet, of all the spiritual truths during the Christmas season, of all of them, and quite a few we're going to look at here in this month, in this season, it's really hard to grasp any of them until we grasp the first spiritual truth, which is our world is dark. It's in darkness. And listen, we have many things to be grateful for, and there's many things in this world to be excited about. And there are many glimpses and images of the presence of God and the character of God, even in people. As broken as human beings are, we still see the glimpses of the nature of God in us. So this isn't a total dystopian kind of idea when I say that our world is dark, and yet we live in a dark world. And there are many cultures and many people all over the world trying to convince themselves and each other that we have the ability as humans to change that we can actually get ourselves out of darkness. But the first spiritual truth, the starting place, is recognizing we actually can't. With our technologies, and listen, I'm all about innovation. I'm kind of a tech geek. I love thinking about the future, and I follow futurists. And some of the things NASA and SpaceX are doing and innovations just fascinate me. And I follow a lot of these trends. And yet the idea that technology or the advancement of medicine or education can somehow cure the human condition, it's not reality. And much of the world continues from generation to generation. We'll be the generation. We're going to actually solve the division. We're going to actually fix racism. And though we can advance, and equity matters, and we should be fighting for equity, and we see even in American history advances that I believe are the hand of God using so many people and oftentimes his church leading the way. There is something broken in the human heart that humans cannot repair. And so the starting place in understanding and really getting and appreciating the truths of Christmas and everything that's represented in the symbols and the traditions of this season, we've got to begin with this idea that the reality that our world is in darkness. And we cannot save ourselves. Humans do not have the ability to save ourselves. Isaiah was a prophet in the Old Testament among the Jewish people the people of God in the Old Testament who were to represent him to other people and eventually extend his love and reality to the whole world. And of course, they failed in doing that. They continued to choose selfishness and inward-focused living. And so eventually Jesus would come and fulfill what they were supposed to be and do. Isaiah, the prophet of Israel, speaks, foretells, well generations in advance of Jesus, of his coming. And he says in Isaiah 9, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. It's interesting to notice here that Isaiah does not say, Scripture does not say that from the world a light has emerged or sprung. He actually says, on the world, upon the world, a light has dawned. This light will come from the outside. It's not going to come from human innovation or human ingenuity or from human intellect. There's something outside of humanity that will come to rescue us from darkness, from the selfishness, the perpetual self-serving, self-elevation, hate, and surrendering to the habits and defaults of human nature, of jealousy, and as simple as gossip can sound, it's like we cannot break the pattern of calling out others. Now, in this generation on social media, it's that we see these signs of darkness all around us, and it angers all of us and frustrates all of us. And so we vote and we get passionate about politics, and we talk about this a lot. We're trying to find a solution, and we debate and we argue at work, and this is humanity wanting a fix for what ails humanity. And Scripture tells us that humans do not have the capacity of repairing what's broken in the human heart. Then in the New Testament, the story of Jesus begins to unfold. John, arguably Jesus' closest disciple, in his gospel, the good news, or the gospel of Jesus, in John's account, he says in chapter 1, in him, in Jesus, was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The darkness cannot push back on this light. However bad humans, when you think of the worst, like what are the worst moments? The Holocaust, like those kinds of moments, or just in your last 10 years, the experiencing bullying or the betrayal of a friend, or whatever you can define darkness, human darkness for you. John tells us that the darkness of planet Earth and broken Earth cannot push back on this light. This is a powerful light that has come to change and illuminate what's dark. John goes on to say the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. The Word, the message, the voice of God became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And he came to shatter the dark, the despair, the hopelessness, and to actually turn the human heart into hearts of hope and life-giving beings that we crave to be. Okay, one more example here of Jesus being the light. This is in Matthew's gospel. Matthew says, the people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. He's referring, of course, back to Isaiah's prophecy. So I'm going to stay in Matthew for the rest of our time here. Matthew does something really interesting. He's one of the two gospel writers who actually tells the Christmas story. And it's fascinating how Matthew begins his story, his telling of the life of Jesus. There's some things that Matthew is not saying, intentionally not saying in his story of Jesus. And then there's a couple of interesting things that he does say in the way he writes, particularly at the beginning of his story of the life of Jesus. What he's not saying is that this is some kind of legend or once upon a time. Now, he wouldn't have used that language in his day, but the equivalent in first century Judea, Matthew does not use the language of mythology or some kind of legendary tale. He does something very different. And it's so intentional, and it's a technique that historians use. He begins with a genealogy, like a family lineage. And I'll tell you, growing up in the church, whenever this was referred to, or God forbid, read, like read out loud all the verses of the great-great-grandfathers and grandparents of Jesus, and the list that just seemed to never end, it's like, man, how boring can this be? Why would you start this remarkable story this way? Years ago, a man that I had the privilege of pastoring, and I feel very safe telling this story. This was many years ago. In fact, a couple of years later, which was many years ago, he moved out of the area. He reached out to me to say, hey, would you pray for this weekend I have coming up? I have a pretty stressful job event project at work this weekend. And then the weekend happened. And then on Monday, he reached out to me and said, I need to process with you what happened. And so we got together early on a Monday morning and maybe a Tuesday morning and early in the week. And he said, I knew that he had a very classified job. And he tells me this dramatic story that he, in the middle of the night on, I don't know, Friday night or Saturday night, our time, in some distant corner of the world, rappelled in the cover of night from a helicopter onto a rooftop and extracted some people out of a building who needed to be rescued. And in the darkness of night, flew away. And here he is back home, 24 hours later. And there was so much stress involved that he wanted to process this with his pastor. And I'm like, I feel like you're describing James Bond to me. Like this is like a Mission Impossible kind of story. Wow. And I just want to ask you, if you had some kind of story like this, dramatic story to tell a friend or a group of people, I can guarantee you're not going to start that story over coffee early on a Monday or Tuesday morning. So let me begin the story with my great-great-great-grandfather. Grew up in a little town in Belgium, and he met my great-great-great-grandmother, and they had a baby, and that baby sailed across the ocean. And the person you're telling the story to would be super confused, if not totally bored. Like, I thought this was an important story. I thought you had something dramatic to tell me. You would want to get to the action, or like, hey, what's the big thing that happened, or what's the life-changing event? And so it always kind of perplexed me and confused me and really sort of spiritually frustrated me. Like Matthew, the first gospel writer, the first book of the New Testament, who begins by telling of the arrival of God on planet Earth, begins with a family lineage, a list of family ancestry, a genealogy of all these great-great-grandparents of Jesus. And it just seems like, man, how boring could this be? What is the relevance of this? And Matthew is doing something genius here, and he's doing something that gives so much credibility to the story of God arriving, the advent of God's presence on our planet. So before we kind of break down the genealogy, and please, if that, even just the sound of that, like Brad's going to read the genealogy, I'm going to read a portion of it. If that just makes you want to kind of tune out or distracts you, or you start thinking about football, or please stay with me. This is life-changing for us as we gain confidence that God has a plan. In all the confusion and chaos and hurt of this world, God is actually moving us toward his good and is inviting us into his plan. So one more quick anecdote here, or story, is that Mackenzie and I just finished watching the newest Star Wars television series called Andor, and we loved it. I think it's the best written Star Wars material yet to date. I'm a fan of The Mandalorian. I've been saying that Andor I think is even better. It just gives so much detail into why the Empire is so evil. Before all the original movies began, before the storyline, before we see Darth Vader, we're seeing on a level of depth of character development and motivation and what's driving the empire, why and how they're so evil. And as much as I love the series, and many people around the world do, there are fans around the world who aren't so crazy about it because it's not as action-packed as what we're used to seeing in Star Wars movies. In fact, some of you have actually told me this. We've had some friendly debates about this series, and some of you have said, yeah, there's just not enough lightsabers and not enough TIE fighting scenes. And I just love the character and story development, the background, the context that tells us, wow, now we know why Darth Vader was so evil. Mackenzie, just throughout the series, was like, this is making so much sense. These are evil people. And I think a lot of times we want to jump to the action. We want to just see the practical. We want to know hurry up and tell me why this is practical for me. And Matthew's doing something really important in giving us this background of Jesus' lineage to give us credibility. Now, in our day, we don't see much relevance in just grandfather after grandfather, and this person gave birth to this person, and this. That just seems like a boring list to us. But when this was used in the ancient world, this is pointing to, hey, you can research this. These are people. You could go to this town and meet some of their ancestors and ask them questions. I want to read you a part of the genealogy here. We're not going to go through the whole thing. And I want to point out just something fascinating about this list of Jesus' ancestors from the Jewish line of the Hebrew people. In Matthew chapter 1, this is the genealogy of Jesus. This is how the New Testament begins and how Matthew's gospel begins. The genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Seems totally irrelevant. Let's skip ahead. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. David, the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. And then we come to, near the end of the genealogy, Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. What is Matthew doing by beginning the New Testament, by beginning his account of the greatest story? Talk about life-changing and action, and what can alter human reality. The story of Jesus is it. This is the pinnacle of all human history. He begins with this list. And the first thing he's doing is grounding Jesus in history. This isn't some fable. This isn't a once upon a time. This is a real person who has existed and comes from a real story of preparing the hearts of humans for God's arrival. But he does something else in telling us the condition that Jesus would come into, the kind of world that Jesus would come into, that he was arriving to, a very broken place, a place of darkness. One way that Matthew's genealogy of Jesus is so different, so radically different from many genealogies is that women are included. This is unheard of in the ancient world. Women were just considered irrelevant to any kind of credible evidence in court. They didn't have a voice. Talk about voting. I mean, they didn't even have a voice of credibility in society. And here in Matthew's genealogy, following Jesus, who actually accepted followers of him, who were part of his story, women, Matthew, who would later write his account of the life of Jesus, intentionally includes 5 women in the genealogy of Jesus. And I want to just focus on this in the rest of our time here in the next few minutes. Jesus includes Tamar and Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba and Mary. Part of the point that Jesus is making is everyone is going to be included in this story. Everyone is included in the invitation of our God. No one will be excluded. There are no racial outsiders, as with 3 of these women who were not Jewish. They were Gentiles. 1 Moabite woman and 2 Canaanite women. I mean, unclean, considered unclean to the Jewish people. Jesus is a descendant intentionally of outsiders. Let's just look at a couple of these examples. Tamar tricks her father-in-law into sleeping with her. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this other than to say we would say, well, that's in our culture, that's just not okay. In this culture, in ancient Hebrew culture, this makes someone spiritually and morally unclean. This is unacceptable for a human being. This incest, it almost made you not human in this culture. And Tamar ends up in the list of Jesus' ancestors. Rahab, famously in the story of Joshua, was the prostitute in Jericho who hides the spies, the Jewish spies who were spying the land. And she had heard the stories of Israel's God, the true God, who held true power. And she wants to be part of God's story, the true God of Israel. And she's invited, not just as a Canaanite woman, as an outsider, a racial outsider, a gender outsider, as a woman, but she is invited to be part of the family of God, and she becomes one of the great-great-grandmothers of Jesus. Ruth was an outsider and really had to be sort of adopted into the people of Israel. It's super interesting when you read about David. You're like, oh, David, a figure of royalty. Well, Jesus is descending from David, from royalty, but it's interesting how Matthew, the way he words this about David. David, the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. If you don't know the story of Uriah and his wife, you just think, well, why wouldn't he name the woman? Why wouldn't he name the mother? Why does he say David, the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife? Because Matthew is intentionally calling our attention to the story of Uriah and his wife, where David and Uriah, one of his best friends, one of his mighty warriors, while Uriah is at battle, David sees Uriah's wife and he wants her and sleeps with her, and then devises a plan to have his close friend Uriah killed in battle so that he can make Bathsheba his wife. And Matthew intentionally uses this wording so that when we read these words, Uriah's wife, we remember the story. This is not a Jesus descendant from royalty from David. This is a David made a horrible mistake and chose selfishly and murdered a man. And Jesus descends from this woman, Bathsheba. It's part of the soap opera of the Old Testament. Jesus is actually descending from stories like this. The genealogy is dripping with mercy, the mercy of God. And this is the point. And this is really where we start in this first week of the Christmas series. In our last couple minutes here, I just want to say the point of Matthew, starting with this list that can read so boring to us and just make us yawn, like, why does the most important story in the world begin with this list of ancestors? Because Matthew is showing us that every person needs the grace and mercy of God. Every single person is broken. And Jesus came into not a palace. He wasn't born into royalty. He was born into the dirt and grime of a horse trough, a horse manger. And that is a foreshadow of Jesus hanging on the cross, crying out, "My Father, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus, the story of Jesus is coming into our darkness to reverse, to take the death and grossness and what would make someone unclean in Old Testament culture, to take all of our habits or guilt or shame or regrets, our selfish choosing, the way we just want to defend ourselves or elevate ourselves. He took all of that onto the cross so that we could be free, so that the light, the heart-changing light of Jesus could permeate each one of us, regardless of what we've done, regardless of what we've chosen. We're equally broken, is what the genealogy teaches us. We're equally lost. We can equally accept God's love. Matthew does not begin the story of Jesus with good advice. He begins with good news, that God chose to come into our filth and horrible decisions and deepest regrets. This is the story of darkness that our God chose to come into. And so on this week one of our Christmas series, God Come Close, I just want to pray this simple prayer with you, that we would pray God come close, recognizing he already has. He's actually inviting us to come close. So Jesus, as we say, would you come close to the challenge at work, to the hurt in my parenting, to the mistakes of my past, to the regrets I carry? Would you, God, come close to me in my anxiety, my worry? You are actually reminding us in the story of Christmas that you have come close. You've come into our darkness. And you're inviting us to come close to you. God, I ask that you take my darkness and illuminate it, make it alive, fill it with life, make me whole. Jesus, only you can do this. Only you can change my heart, the way I think about my past, the way I think of others, the way I choose to respond to people who've treated me so unfairly. You can actually change me to look like you and to think like you. Jesus, in this Christmas season, I give you my life. I'm so grateful for the way Matthew began his story of Jesus, this credible list of true people from real places and from hurt and salacious details and choosing and selfishness. This is the dark that our God chose to come into. And it's as alive and relevant and practical today as it's ever been. I look forward to next week with you, Dulles family, as we continue our series. An early Merry Christmas. Have a great week. I'll see you online this week.